Hello, today we have a special episode of the Tree Fort podcast. As you probably can hear, I'm not Denne, because Denne could not be here today, but that shouldn't stop us from having an interesting conversation. Today we are talking about superheroes and how it have went from this nerd culture into pop culture. And today with us we have Rune Ravlund, who is a professor at STU and is extremely interested in this pop culture phenomenon and also have studied this tremendously. And to have somebody to replace Dennis for this episode, we have Mikkel again, who is also interested in pop culture in terms of superheroes and Game of Thrones and basically everything else, and is a certified nerd.
Thank you.
So, welcome to you, Rune.
Thank you.
And welcome to you, Mikkel, again.
Thank you.
Okay, well, in this last month, there have happened a lot of things in terms of this pop culture, nerd culture, if you can. We of course have Endgame, which is the biggest superhero movie ever made, which have been built up throughout 10 years. And when we have, quite recently, we have the final of Game of Thrones. And these events are huge all around the world. I mean, Avengers is the biggest box office. I don't know if they have surpassed Avatar yet.
Not yet.
But still, it has broken all sorts of records and is on second place at the moment. And Game of Thrones is probably the biggest budget, fantasy, series that have ever been made. So just to start off with, what kind of relationship do you have to this genre, if you will, Rune?
Yeah, I mean, so if we're talking like Game of Thrones, that'd be fantasy. We think about Avengers, and that'd be big comic books. I mean, both of them. I've been a certified nerd since I was born, almost, I guess, something like that. But I read tons of comic books when I was a kid, and one of the first books I ever wanted to read was The Hobbit, because my mom read it for me. So I sort of got at that sort of almost in with from very early childhood. And I ended up playing role-playing games and computer games and whatnot throughout my teens. So it's been very much part of who I am and what I do. And then, of course, I've ended up doing it as a job as well. But I've seen it change from being like this super nerdy thing that you weren't really supposed to do if you're going to be one of the cool kids, to being a thing that's become a sort of an overall mainstream phenomenon. So even just that I also find interesting as a scholar of pop culture. There's the change in the perception of the nerdy and the nerd, and that it's perfectly acceptable to be that, and even that it could be kind of cool to be nerdy, to know a lot of stuff about really weird stuff like dragons or, I don't know, the ability to fly and so on.
Yeah, I've always been a bit of a nerd, but it really took off in my teen years, especially when I was an exchange student in the United States, because that was the first time I went to a comic book store, and it was heaven. So I spent a lot of my allowance that year on comic books, and I brought quite a few of them home. And I've always loved stuff like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, so it's just been something I've been spending more and more time with ever since my childhood.
Could I add to that? Just this idea of the comic book store, because when I was a kid in the 80s, there was only one place basically in Copenhagen. It's called Fantastic. And I went there, and the fact they had comic books and role-playing games and tabletop games and so on, and going in there every 3 months or so, spending my entire allowance on whatever money I had, which is like heaven, and it's weird.
Yeah. Every time I visit Copenhagen, I go to Far Cigar. Yeah, and now they're combining with Dragon Slayer here in Odense, so we're going to finally get comics in a store in Odense, so yes.
But that's kind of the interesting thing about it, because it is comic books used to be strictly American in a sense. It originated in America, and it was even back up. When did the comic books exactly sort of start as a genre?
Well, just to correct you a little bit, it's not only in America, because of course you have a Belgian and a French tradition as well. These two quite strong traditions. But yes, comics we know nowadays, as we see it in cinema mainly, are American. But just to say that there's a European tradition as well.
Okay.
You can also go on to the Japanese. There's a very strong Japanese tradition as well. So one famous, I'm sure you know that one as well, the Captain America one, in which he beats up Hitler.
Yeah.
And that's obviously sort of propaganda, and also the fact he's Captain America. You can't get much more patriotic than that, right? But it has changed throughout the years, as you also, I mean, some of the more recent superhero movies that you'll see critique of America and of, freedom and Western liberal democracy and so on. But it started out, obviously, yes, as a sort of sheer propaganda machine almost.
Actually, I read a year ago, I think, Grant Morrison's book, Supergod. Grant Morrison is a very famous superhero comic writer, which he talks about his own childhood and his introduction to superheroes, where he talks about growing up in Scotland and how it was the GIs stationed there during the war who brought comics with them.
Yeah.
And because they left them behind, all kinds of kids read them, and that led to suddenly comic book stores appearing in Britain, which was how the comic book industry in Britain really got its start, which I think is a very interesting way that it's been spreading.
And it's also, I mean, because before I went, I've been here for 4 or 5 years, but before that I was teaching in Glasgow. And Glasgow has the largest, biggest saturation, I think, of comic book stores anywhere I've been. It's like slightly larger than Copenhagen, but it had like 20, 25 comic book stores. And there's lots of like comic book artists coming from Scotland as well. And they have actually comic book studies at the University of Glasgow, for instance. So, yeah, that's probably coming from that, actually. Never thought about that.
Yeah. From my childhood, basically, when I wasn't that much into comic book, I loved Spider-Man, and I still love Spider-Man to this day, but it was mostly in sort of cartoons on television. But I still remember, as you probably also mentioned growing up, that there was still this sort of stigma about comic book and superheroes. It was still in this sort of nerd culture that it wasn't popular, and it was sort of the outsiders who liked this stuff. So I can even remember, and I don't even think I'm that old yet, it's kind of interesting to see how I grew up to how it's basically the biggest pop culture phenomenon there is today. I mean, everybody was talking about Avengers, and people couldn't stop talking about Game of Thrones final because they have waited years for these things to happen. And I also think this build-up of these comic book movies have sort of created this hype. But even in the comic book movies, because there was a lot also in the 80s, but it wasn't as popular, they were sort of different. And I was a big fan of Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man back in the early 2000s. Even from the early 2000s to now, there's a huge shift in it. It was like they tried to sort of avoid these sort of nerdy tropes. Also, for example, in the first X-Men movie, they tried to sort of avoid the comic books costumes they normally use because it was too nerdy. I kind of find it interesting how it originated in that sense, but they try to, at the same time, try to distance it, whereas now they sort of embrace it instead.
Sure. Well, I mean, first of all, I should say I am very old, so I remember the movies of the 80s, and at the point there were like Superman and Spider-Man, there weren't that many, and then, I mean, they're only like a couple of years in between. But yes, I think it's changed for every decade, and it's become more and more popular. But I think it's also, there's a more general trend here as well. I mean, I don't want to go too far to like cultural studies and
you can do that.
Okay, but the thing is, so what I think is so we got Silicon Valley. I'm going to go away just for for just a short while here, because the way in which the nerds are the one who make tons and tons of money, and they have all the power now. Silicon Valley is basically ruling the world. That is nerd culture, and that also means that, and alongside that, these are people who've been reading comic books, but it also showed the rest of the world that if you're really nerdy, really clever, really focused in an almost unhealthy way, you can actually be successful. So I think that's part of it. But there's also just been a more general acceptance of difference, and that goes for gender, race, sexuality, and so on. So it's a part of a much larger picture. But I find it, as an old-timer in this, I find it extremely heartening when I go to a place like Bastard Cafe in Copenhagen, this huge board game playing cafe, like hundreds of tables there. First of all, you see people in all different ages, but you also see lots of people who are 18, 20. You also see like lots of super hardcore geeks, but you also see fairly regular young people. And the fact that everyone is there, sitting there together, is a sort of it's just a sign of the acceptance of the fact that the difference and this nerdiness is a cool thing, or at least an okay thing. But then going back to the idea of how it's changed in terms of going mainstream. You mentioned Game of Thrones early on. Game of Thrones and the Avengers and the other superhero films they become part of a much. I mean, so in the old days, there'd be Superman 1 or 2 or 3, and there'd be some sort of continuity in it. But in this, I mean, Avengers, what is it, 22?
22, I think, yeah.
Yeah, and there was this, coming up to the last one, when I beat my notes, I was like, oh, you have to watch all of them. Or like, if you only want to watch 10, what should it be? So you sort of go in there with this knowledge. You have to almost know all of this. You need to be able to get all the different clues and the Easter eggs in there. And it's become perfectly acceptable to have that knowledge, and you can sort of compete with your friends with this. And then the same thing with Game of Thrones. And that'd be people who are 55 or 15 who discuss this, right? And again, people who wouldn't normally be considered to be the people who'd go into fantasy. And I just find that like massively fascinating. And then the fact that this nerd phenomenon has just spread to become a major mainstream thing.
I think, at least from how I've experienced it, a lot of it has to do with the internet and being able to find other geeks, other nerds so easily. That there's a forum for everything. Everywhere there's somebody you can discuss things. Because I've really found that these are places where I find people who know as much as I do and who want to discuss these things and be nerdy about it and discuss weird comic book science that has no actual science in it, but still discuss, is this believable? Why did it do this? And stuff like that. And I think that's been there for a while, but that we've really just seen that migrate out into, the real world, that suddenly, people are also meeting up and they're actually, participating in things in real life, not just sitting behind the screen. At least that's how I feel some of the time.
I think, that connectivity is really, you're right, because, these groups would have been there before, but for instance, me being a nerdy kid when I was 12 years old, I could only sort of infect the immediate group around me. Like, I'd drag on everyone to play role-playing games and so on, but I would have no contact with anyone else outside of that, because it just wouldn't be any system for doing that. But internet definitely has helped do that.
That's actually kind of interesting. It reminds me of a personal story from my life. I had a friend in middle school who was basically in this sort of cool kid squad, if you will. But every day after school we sort of hanged out, and he would Dragon Ball Z every time, and he was extremely much into them, but he never talked with his other friends, and we also played video games in the weekends and so on. So he was extremely nerdy in some sense, but when we were in school and he was with all the other kids, he sort of has a completely different persona. So there was this kind of different way of acting between what kind of social group you are in. And it's something I still think of to this day, that in a sense it was sort of a space for him and as well as me where we could sort of go together, because we come sort of from two different worlds in these social groups, and you don't have to pretend to be something you're not, if you will, or pretend you don't like something just because it's not cool. And as you mentioned, that was sort of before the internet blew up for my time. Now where it's much easier to sort of these people of different groups sort of to meet in some places, because it's been much more acceptable, and you can meet these people other ways instead of it sort of have to be hidden behind friendship between people.
Yeah, and now it's building, like, if you look at like international newspapers and so on with the Game of Thrones or Avengers, it'd be like they have like main articles on like geeking out massively about different things, and obviously it'd be totally cool to talk about this. I just have a short anecdote with some of my friends who used to play a lot of role-playing games and comic book nerds. Going into the 20s and 30s, they got married, had kids and so on, and every fourth weekend they would go out on these like guys trips, and all their wives thought they were like going on trips to abroad to get drunk and strippers, I don't know. Actually, they went to sort of summer house 2 days, played role-playing games and drank Coca-Cola and whatever, and that was with it. But they were too embarrassed to tell their wives about it and everyone else. So they just sat there while they thought they were out.
But to be fair, that sounds a lot more fun than going to strip clubs.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's how, but I just do the weird thing that actually, even for their own family, they were like, and they thought like, oh, the boys will be boys. Like, yeah, but they'll be boys. But yeah. But
that's also kind of an interesting dynamic, because these people also of course, got kids, and sort of then they got up an excuse to go see these movies as well, which in a sense also it's a way to excuse for the family that we're going to see it because of the kids, but they also want to see it as well. And that's also, I think, a way to integrate this into the mainstream, if you will.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the ways that this has really become something that was more acceptable was also in through children's television. I mean, the original Batman the Animated Series was a children's TV series, but it was so well made, and there was so much love and craft going into it that even today, grown-ups will go and will sit and watch it because it's just it's a great take on the character where they really respect the mythos and make it really entertaining. So I think stuff like that has really helped because it draws in the kids, and then when they go look back at it later, it'll still hold up. It'll still be great, and that's a way for them to fall in love with the characters.
But I think there's also a seriousness here. I mean, and so if we take the old Batman, not the animated, but from the 60s, if you've ever seen the classics, with Bruce Lee's even in it. I mean, that's so super silly and camp. But then you go the Dark Knight later on, and the darker turn of DC and so on, but the overall idea that we have the silliness of the Marvel movies, but they also take up quite serious subjects like torture, interrogation, freedom, and all these different things here. So that's also legitimized it to some extent, I think, in terms of more people going to see it.
Yeah. Also, I mean, the way that the Marvel handled their movies was very much that they. Of course, there were always superhero movies, but then they blended them with other genres. The first Captain America movie is a war film, and the second one is a 70s spy thriller and stuff like that. So they're kind of mixing things in that people know from elsewhere, which means that it's always a fresh. There's also some kind of freshness to it. I think that's really part of their recipe for success.
What I like about it personally is how they try to make these superheroes relatable, because of course they do have these sort of godly powers that does not in any way fit in reality, but they do still have these conflicts. And as you're talking about, especially Captain America and Iron Man in the Civil War movie, it was basically this ideological conflict of having two different ways of looking at things and how they should, how adventures sort of should be portrayed. Should they be controlled or should they be free? And both sides, you can basically take both sides, because I think it has been presented in an extremely logical and good way of showing that these people are not just superheroes who can do everything, but they actually do have conflicts and have conflict in between each other, and that's something that's going on throughout all the movies. I mean, people talked about how is Iron Man and Captain America going to meet each other again, and how they're going to interact when they have to fight against Thanos.
Yeah, I think part of that is part of Marvel's DNA from their very first days as being Marvel, because Stan Lee, the genius of him was that when he made his characters, he saw that at that time superhero comic books was falling out of popularity. They weren't as popular as comics anymore. At that time, the popular comics were melodramatic teenage romances and monsters. So what did he do? He turned the superheroes into someone who had, believable dynamic tension and dynamics and romance, and that they fought giant monsters. So he tapped into these things that were really popular. But a really core part of it was the fact that there were humans behind the mask.
Yeah.
That they had these struggles. I mean, that's the core of Spider-Man is not his powers. It's the fact that he's a teenager who struggles with having these great powers and the great responsibility while still being in school and trying to get the girl.
Yeah, that's why I loved Spider-Man, this struggle between his personal life and his responsibility of being a superhero. And he can never just sort of have both be perfect lives. He has sort of to choose all the time. That's what I love about Spider-Man on a personal level, and why I think he's such a great character. And
but how many Spider-Man reboots can there be? I've given up. I really can't be bothered anymore. I mean, and I was even I did the last two Avengers movies. I did enjoy them, but we've discussed this before, prior occasion. But I mean, at the end of it, I was just really tired. I saw some of them. I've seen maybe 12, 15 of them or so. But I mean, at the end of it, I was just really, yet another superhero movie. I mean, I would have loved it when I was 15, but I mean, they still have great qualities. And I think especially for me, because what I do in my research also in terms of ecology and the collapse of the world, because we spend too much, especially the whole Thanos. That one is basically just about ecology to me.
Yeah.
And he's like a hardcore deep ecologist, actually. Like the really, really hardcore deep ecologist is just saying, like, kill humanity because so the rest can survive, right? That's basically what he's doing.
Well, to be fair for me, I don't consider the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man because I hated that Spider-Man. I thought it was awful. I still have some sort of love to Tobey Maguire's Spider, but I don't think he was a great Spider-Man, but I think he was a great Peter Parker. But even today, seeing these movies, the costumes are awful. I mean, they're so corny. But I personally love the new Spider-Man. I think he's doing a great job.
And he's also the most believable teenage Spider-Man.
Still the youngest, right?
Absolutely. But also, he really hits the right notes on all counts, which I think is very impressive. Because they have struggled with that. I mean, I thought the best part of the Andrew Garfield stuff was when he was in the costume and he was, making quips with the villains, because that's where he really was shining. But they just do it better in the new ones, while also getting all the Peter Parker stuff right.
But the problem with Andrew Garfield Spider-Man, that he did that when he was Spider-Man, but he did the same thing when he was Peter Parker.
Yeah.
It was basically the same character, no matter if he was in the costume or not. I couldn't stand that Spider-Man. But talking about the new Spider-Man with Homecoming, also in this sort of nerd culture, pop culture, it's kind of interesting how they sort of changed some of the characters. For example, Flash Thompson was usually this bully, and it was normally the classic bully who sort of beat up people.
Yeah.
But in Homecoming, he's more of a sort of a verbal bully and basically just teasing Peter Parker all the time. Because now that this superhero have become mainstream, it doesn't make sense to have a bully basically mocking the doggy guy, because he like the same sort of mainstream pop culture as the doggy kids does. So the bully has also changed over time, and I think that's an interesting take on it, even though there's a lot of people who sort of hated the new because it wasn't original to the source material or whatever. So I think Marvel has done a great job of changing with the times as well.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I think the new Flash Thompson is I think it's kind of great what they did, because the classic take on him being the football star and stuff like that.
The job.
Yeah, it worked at the time, but even in the comics by now they've moved on. I mean, he's a completely different character today. In the comics, he's a war vet who lost his legs and then somehow got the symbiote and became Agent Venom, where he was like a super soldier for the government. So he's been like doing way other things, so even they've moved away from that character as it was originally.
About sort of taking these comic book elements, that's also sort of fascinating. How exactly do they take these comic book elements that is in a way sort of absurd? I mean, take Doctor Strange, he's a magician, and sort of trying to make it into a universe in a sort of movie franchise and sort of make it believable and make people to buy it, which is sort of the same. It is basically a fantasy in a way. And I think a lot of people sort of, when they think of comic books, they sort of shake their head, because some of the things they come up with, I mean, some of the characters are basically just guards, and try to make it into an interesting character and still have these character developments. Only you have read a lot of comic books. How do you think of this way of seeing these characters evolving into the cinema compared to how they are from the source material?
I mean, first, if we just take up the difference between the everyday man, who's like the one with no superpowers like Batman or whatever, and then sort of ranking up through the more and more godlike powers. I always struggled a bit with the whole, I mean, Thor and all that, the pure mythology. I mean, even goes beyond fantasy, it's pure mythology.
I have the same problem.
And I never just really related much to it. I like the grittier, more. I mean, I was like Superman. I was always like, oh, he can just do everything. What's the point of it?
Yeah.
But even so, like, I was, as a kid, I was always like trying to figure out, what if you pitted Superman against Spider-Man against whatever? And you have all these ludicrous, of course, versus battles there sometimes. So in terms of how they migrated from comic books onto to films, that just as a one more comment is, of course, also that as the same thing as in the monster genre in the 30s and 40s and 50s in Hollywood, they were sort of running out of monsters, and they sort of kept adding to the roster of different weird beings. The same thing happened, obviously, in comic books. I mean, they just got incredibly more ludicrous. And like Doctor Strange, I've always just found really weird. Yeah. Obviously, that's the point of him. But also, I find it difficult to relate to, because it was too silly for me in that sense. Personal taste, of course. But I mean, the Marvel universe is just so huge now. They have so many, and just the poster for the movie is also kind of ridiculous, but fun. I mean, I did like the last two movies, but it's just sort of just exploded. Also, I mean, just trying to keep track of all these different things, it's just really, really difficult, and actually like really geeking out on it. Yeah.
I think concerning Doctor Strange, I think it's interesting that both from his original appearances in the Jack Kirby drawn comics, there he was massively powerful. I mean, he would have I mean, he would have defeated Thanos no problem. I mean, he was so amazing. But then over the years, in the comics, they've slowly depowered him. I mean, they've had big events that stripped him of his godliness slowly but surely. So today he's not at all, and I think they really asserted some great limits for him in the movie, because they took him, because they'd done like the original take on his character, he would have been a complete misfit. But today he's still, I mean, in the movies he's still powerful, but they talk about these limitations of if you break the laws of nature, things will go wrong, horribly wrong. So they kind of try and limit him in some ways, which I think was needed.
But with others they sort of amped it up. It's now you got Captain Marvel, it's called super strong, and then you also got Phoenix coming out. I don't know when it's coming.
But for the second time.
But I remember because I remember back when I was reading the X-Men like 25 years ago. There's this one where Phoenix just goes like on a rampage. She flies away from planet Earth, goes to some other solar system, and just fries an entire planet. And I just remember like this is. I was fascinated and terrified by it. But it was like, this is on such a different scale. Then Wolverine comes along and can stab a few people. And like, how are they even the same league?
Yeah.
But there's maybe also going back to that, so actually the transition of comic books to films in terms of the more serious. I mean, you got the city ones like Guardians of the Galaxy, which I loved, by the way. But then you got the sort of more serious, darker, more grim movies like Logan. Have you seen that one where he's grown old and they could spoil it. A lot of people die in that movie, but I really love that one. The fact that you sort of see like superheroes when they're sort of gritty and not as powerful as he used to be.
Yeah.
And this also goes back to some of my other favorite comic books, or graphic novels, was Watchmen by Alan Moore, which
that's great.
Because he also provided a lot of stories for American superhero books. But in Watchmen, basically, you have this idea of almost all the superheroes in it are not particularly powerful, and they're just basically vigilantes. So it's all about the democracy versus fascism, basically, because basically all superheroes are fascists, because it's about the strong man and the strong woman here, right? So at the point in which the superhero genre goes in to sort of critique this idea of having individuals that can come and save us, rather than all of us standing together trying to save the world. And it's also one of the appeal of superhero movies. Like everything is going to pot basically. But if only you have this idea of superheroes coming here to save us, rather than us, not flying and eating meat and not killing each other and bombing people and so on. So I think that's what some of the superhero movies can do, something really interesting, or have done something with some of the movies at least.
I personally also loved the Watchmen. I bought it personally from Mikkel to read it over summer, and I also wanted to read it. What I love about Watchmen is more sort of the way the superheroes have their way of thinking, their ideology. It's completely different all the time. I mean, Rorschach is sort of this black and white character, and then you got Ozymandias, who's sort of this utilitarian, sort of like a Thanos character who's willing to kill.
He's actually that parallel is absolutely there.
Yeah,
he's Thanos anyway.
Yeah. And that's what I love most about him. When you got Dr. Manhattan, who cannot relate to humanity anymore because he's basically become a god. But also, I thought what you said was kind of interesting, that the way they sort of evolve these characters in the cinema. You talked about Guardians of the Galaxy. It's a more silly movie. It's more a comedy. And you also thought you could really relate to Thor. And I had sort of the same problem with Thor when they bring this mythology in to make him a superhero. But it seems like they are now trying to make him more of a comic relief. And I actually think he works a lot better as a comic relief character than he does as this serious grunt who just a Norse god who's going down and drink a lot of beer and kill stuff.
Yeah, I mean, even Chris Hemsworth, who plays Thor, he by the second Thor movie, he was starting to hate playing the character because he thought it was so boring. I mean, he didn't feel any connection to his own character, which is, I mean, terrible. So he literally went to Kevin Feige, the producer who was really in charge of the whole thing, and said, I can't do this. We got to change this up because I'm burned out here. Yeah. And so they were, but the good thing is, of course, that then they were very receptive to that and tried to change it. So,
yeah, I loved the new one.
But I sort of in this superhero genre, I sort of always feel that at some point we kind of need to stop if you think about it. I mean, we always say now you build up this Thanos character, and it's sort of the epitome of the sort of first Avengers, and it's always weird how we're going to keep on continuing, because you talked about you sort of had a burnout of superheroes, and I also know that you have sort of zombies a lot, but you also have a burnout of because you have doing so much. And I'm kind of interested in where we can keep on going with superhero genre, if we can keep making it interesting. I personally think like a character like Captain Marvel I don't think she's a great character. I don't think the movie was bad, but she's sort of like the same with Superman. She's too powerful, and it becomes sort of stale to watch a person you can't really defeat.
I think the whole Marvel Cinematic Universe right now is in a bit of a crisis, because they just got rid of like the two biggest characters, the two of the biggest draws, and now they're supposed to go forward, but at the same time they've just acquired the rights to the mutants and the Fantastic Four, but they're still being finishing off those movies that they've made for the other company that had them before. So they're in like a kind of a weird position where they can't start doing stories with those characters, which could help revitalize it a bit, because they're different, but at the same time they stand with all these characters, a lot of whom are either brand new characters or legacy characters. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how they're going to pull that off. I mean, because this could be very difficult for them to actually do engaging movies that people want to see.
I'd be okay with them not pulling it off. I mean, it'll be fine with the hiatus for me. But just again, because I had a bit of a fatigue on it. But also, like, do we really need 2 superhero movies a month? But yeah. But I mean, then there's Watchmen is coming out as a series, like 6 months from now, I think.
Yeah, but from the first trailer, it seems it's set post the comic book.
Yeah.
After the comic book.
Well, basically, no. Yeah, because so what they've said is that they haven't. They've been inspired by Watchmen. And you have Ozymandias, you have Dr. Manhattan, and so on. But the sort of the final event, without spoiling too much of Watchmen, something terrible happens. We don't quite know whether they've kept that or not. So they've taken certain elements of it and certain sort of stylistic characteristics and overall ideas, but it's more of a inspirational piece rather than it's either prequel or sequel to it. So it'll be interesting to see what they do with that. But I think it's one of the most it'll be pretty hype when it comes out, I think.
Yeah, I'm also interested for Watchmen. I mean, personally, before I watched the comic book, I've watched the movie a lot of times. I think, even though a lot of people gave it a bad rap, I still think it's a pretty good movie. Especially, I think, without spoiling again, I think the ending in the movie by Zack Snyder is better than in the comic book, because it sort of makes more sense in the universe, I personally think. But I think it's difficult to sort of make a Watchmen series after the Watchmen comic book, because the event is so big. I cannot really see where they're going with it. Yeah. But there has also been some comic books with Watchmen or graphic novels afterwards.
They made some prequels.
No, some prequels. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, again, I think it's more like based on rather than saying like sort of following on.
Which I guess that could work.
Yeah. But but Alan Moore, just as a comic book creator, I think is a genius in many different ways, and Watchmen is just one of several. But I think, to me, Watchmen is one of the 20 best novels I've ever read. I mean, I've ranked it right alongside some of the other great pieces of literature. But I mean, he's also done like other stuff, like Swamp Thing. If you ever sort of heard of that, was based on sort of ecological fable. But he sort of the interesting thing is he was raised with American comic books, and that's what it took him out of Sheffield. I think where he's from, working class community. Went to the States and very much was writing in the American tradition. Then after that having done that for quite a while, he then decides to do something different, and then he starts to subvert the genre. But as an insider who knows what it's all about, and then saying like, what can we use this for? And that's where something really interesting starts to happen, I think. Yeah,
but he does change a lot of things in his writing, and he does. I think a lot of the things he introduced or reintroduced was very different. I've always wanted to read his stuff on Miracle Man, if you know that. Yeah. They reissued it a couple years ago. It was him followed by, I think, Neil Gaiman, who did a story about one of those incredibly powerful characters, but who much like much like others in Watchmen, he loses touch with reality, and he becomes increasingly this fascist character who believes himself to be a god and destined to rule the earth and stuff like that. And I think that kind of character exploration sounds really interesting, especially from Alan Moore.
Yeah, like a certain Mother of Dragons recently.
Yeah, he also won of the personal award and win some of the best Batman stories. Like he's won the Killing Joke.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he's even on a personal level, I think he's an interesting character because he doesn't give a lot of interviews and sort of hate in a way the way that comic book genre has sort of moved on and sort of been this popular way because he thinks it's sort of lost its roots and he doesn't like a lot of the things. He's pretty hardcore in that terms of being a writer and loving the genre as a whole.
But he calls himself a shaman. I mean, he basically thinks, and I think he quite means almost literally. I mean, I don't think he necessarily thinks he has magical powers, but he's saying that the power of narrative, the fact what we can use stories for, and he looks a bit like it's like an old druid, not droid, but druid. If you've ever seen a few interviews, and then also there's a couple of documentary films with him, and he quite seriously believes that you can change the world through stories, and I do believe that as well.
His Promethea comic book is, he says, is structured like one giant spell, and it's itself a whole meta narrative about the power of stories.
Yeah.
So he does really go into that. Also, I believe he worships a snake woman goddess that is his own personal goddess.
Very
so
nice
he has some interesting opinions.
Yeah.
But there's also this entire aspect which you can, of course, ignore is a financial aspect of Hollywood, especially making a lot of money of this. And that's, of course, have a huge impact in sort of the way they have evolved because they want to keep on making this money. And I think, in a sense, that's where I think we're going to struggle. I mean, is people going to have this fatigue of superhero? Is people going to keep on watching? I know a lot of people have said on the internet that after Infinity War and Endgame, they're basically done. That was the story arc, and we're not really interested anymore because there have been so many. And then you also have a lot of other stories that I think is I personally love. Like Deadpool is an interesting character. They've refused to make a Deadpool movie for years, and Ryan Reynolds tried to make a Deadpool movie, and he wanted to make this movie, but they didn't believe an R-rated superhero movie would make any money, and it basically blew up in the box office. It was one of the highest grossing superheroes movie at the time, especially because it was catering to adults. And I think in that sense, people in Hollywood sort of start realizing that this is not just for teenagers or kids anymore.
I think what Marvel really ought to do, and what I think is a really smart move from Lucasfilm, is that they've recently announced that they're taking a hiatus from making movies after The Rise of Skywalker, the final movie in the new trilogy. So they're taking a 3-year hiatus on making movies, and there will be a TV series on the Disney streaming platform, but otherwise there's not going to be any new movies for 3 years, after which there's going to be a new trilogy by the guys behind Game of Thrones, which will be out every other year. So it's much more stretched out and
Is this Lucasfilms?
Yeah, Lucasfilm.
Okay,
yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that's very smart of them, because I think people were getting a little tired and a little annoyed at this frantic tempo. They were putting out one a year and a bit varying in quality. I think
I quite like Solo as the only person on the planet, I think. But I agree there was too much. But I mean, they acquire that franchise, there will be more movies.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think it's
Yeah.
smart of them to take some breaks and let people digest what they've gotten and then move on to the next thing. I think that's very smart of them. I think Marvel could do that with a lot of their characters. I mean, let people like War Machine and all those characters, let them fade into the background a bit while they focus on other things, and then maybe bring them back later. When
Disney's also busy with Frozen 2, so it's going to take the next 2 or 3 years.
Because I mean, one of the things I dream about is at some point down the line, I would like to see them make a sort of Iron Man legacy movie, where they pick up the threads of some of these side characters who's been really impacted by the storyline of Iron Man and bring them back. Because one of the things they did was that after the third Iron Man movie, they had the Mandarin, which was a whole fake out with he was not actually the Mandarin. But then they did a short film which turned where they basically said that, oh no, there was an actual Mandarin behind, the terror organization that kidnapped him in the first movie. And I think it would be really interesting to see down the line have, War Machine, Spider-Man, and that kid from the third one, Harley. Have them, have to come together to defeat this resurgent Mandarin or something like that. Where they, but do it like in 10 years.
Yeah, and without Gwyneth Paltrow. So just go and do a goop thing. But yeah.
I actually thought that at some point she didn't want to play that role anymore. I mean, she wasn't that much in. I don't remember which Iron Man it was. Was it Iron Man 3 she wasn't in?
No, she was definitely in that one.
That's true.
It was she didn't want to be in. What was the second
Avengers? The
second Avengers, and she didn't want to appear. She didn't want to appear in the Civil War movie. So that's where they had them broken up. I think.
Yeah. Well,
she's basically given up acting, I think, apart from that, yeah.
Well, that's probably for the better. So that's how I watch.
No, I don't. I like other things. I just thought in that her character, that one is annoying. But yeah, and then she's busy writing on
the
Goop Empire, which is the podcast on that one. That is a weird thing.
But I also think the thing about waiting and letting these things rest is that we could also see something about Morgan Stark, the kid, or stuff like that down the line. I think those kind of things would be fun. But as something, way down the line, let it rest for now. We've done for now.
I Guardians of the Galaxy. I can do a few more of those. I like the second one as well.
If they actually do an as Guardians of the Galaxy, I kind of want to watch that one.
I would too, actually. And that one I liked more.
I wasn't that big a fan of the first Guardians of the Galaxy. I thought it was too corny, but the second one I quite liked because I think my expectation was both lower than I sort of knew what I went into. But also there was a lot of hype about the Guardians of the Galaxy when it came out, I remember. But yeah, I think we're going to struggle basically with we have to build a whole new phase with all these new characters, and this is have to be the new. We also need some kind of new bad guy. They need to sort of pop up, and can he be as good as Thanos was in Infinity War and Endgame? And basically, they built him up over 10 years. So I think we're going to have a lot of problems in the future of sort of tying this in as well as still being interesting.
I mean, I'd love to be proven wrong. I'd love for them to just continue making great movies because I like great movies, but.
But I mean, they've actually done that. I mean, so it's just as a sort of a comic book universe. I mean, that's one of the reasons I gave up reading comic books because I couldn't afford it, and it's just so much of it. No, because and you have all these different timelines and different sort of competing worlds in which you have different sorts of Spider-Man, whatever. And I just couldn't keep track of it anymore. And also, I just didn't have the finances for it when I was like 12 or 13. And so at one point, I just gave up. It's just too much information, basically. And that's part of the danger, perhaps, if they continue doing it. I absolutely believe they will do it because it is, it's been such a huge money machine and people love it.
Absolutely.
So. But yeah, but the reboot will be difficult.
But sort of in this way that pop culture have changed. I think it's also have a lot of. You talked about how it sort of involves minorities. Black Panther is an interesting example of how they're sort of a black superhero, and that's also huge because it sort of catered to a group that hasn't been represented in superhero movies. Before that, and at the same way, I also was Wonder Woman from DC was also a huge success. Was a pretty good movie in my opinion. Probably the best DC movie, which doesn't say much. But from a personal standpoint, Rune, do you have a favorite character in these comic books that you sort of loved growing up, or was it just?
Yeah. No, I mean, they started as being Spider-Man.
Yeah.
Batman as well. I mean, again, there weren't that many around. I mean, they weren't translated to Danish. I couldn't get hold of them. But once I discovered X-Men, it was Wolverine by far. So yeah, but I've been dressed, around Halloween as Spider-Man and Batman and whatnot. These different, so those are, and sort of Spider-Man is a bit of a fallback. But I don't watch the movies anymore, and I wouldn't necessarily read new comic books with him and so on. I play the games, but yeah. So I mean, I still love Spider-Man and Wolverine definitely. Is I think he's probably my favorite. It used to be Daredevil when the old ones, the reboot of them in black and white, because they were like very brutal, sort of hardcore, and I loved that when I was a teenager.
Have you watched the Daredevil Netflix series?
Yeah. So it was okay, but he was just very different from what I imagined him to be, and it was okay. But
so you preferred the Ben Affleck Daredevil?
Oh no, I didn't. I just prefer the old black and white from the 80s and 90s. But also because that was all about ninjas, and I was like super much into that. Another part of geekdom. But
there's actually an interesting coincidence right now because one of the comic book runs that has really inspired the Marvel Cinematic Universe was Jonathan Hickman's run on the Avengers, which culminated in the Secret War event, which is a huge thing. It involved every comic book that Marvel put out, so it's very big. But he has just been announced that I think it's next month he's going to reboot the whole line of X-Men comics. And it's basically gonna go. I think he has planned a 5-year run where he's gonna write the 2 main X-Men titles, and is gonna be like editorially in charge of all the others. And this happens at the same time that the Marvel Marvel movies have gotten the rights to the mutants.
Yeah.
So I think it's we might get to see a preview of what we can expect from the Marvel mutant, the Marvel X-Men movies.
But I mean, another interesting side effect of all this, or it's just maybe not a side effect, but the fact, I mean, you have a lot of new indie comics coming out as well. That's not part of that Marvel or DC universe. And I mean, something like The Walking Dead was also an indie to start with. Now it's obviously become a huge franchise. But I mean, if you go to comic book stores now, you get like comic books about everything, like for every age and every profession, whatever, and it's such a huge spread now. And it's been far more accepted as a sort of also in sort of literary studies and so on. You can actually you can do entire degrees actually in graphic novels and comic books and so on. So though it's still not accepted to the same degree that Joyce's Ulysses or I don't know, some of the other great works of literature, it's certainly become, it's because it's gone mainstream in that sense as well, even in the sort of more elitist circles. Yeah.
But I always sort of worry about comic books in the sense of the comic books, because I always think they sort of have this struggle of doing well financially, because there's not that many people who's reading it compared to, of course, people who's watching the movies. And there are so many comic books movies, so I think it's kind of like a daunting task to get into comic books movies, because comic books, because where do you start? And you sort of have to find some place to begin. You talked about they start up with the X-Men, and that might be a place to start, or just basically take a completely different story. But from my personal thing, what I always loved about comic books, also because I'm an American Studies scholar, of course, is that they take these issues up and print it into these sort of superhero, like X-Men is sort of a commentary on segregation and civil rights in the 60s, because these mutants are sort of black people who's trying to get recognized and live in harmony in society.
Yeah, but there's definitely, I mean, the whole idea about the X-Men is basically this idea about otherness and difference, right? The fact that they're not part of whatever's mainstream. And you can take that into race, you can take it into gender and again, sexuality and all sorts of other supposed sort of non-norms. So obviously, yes, it's been a good vehicle for discussing that. But I mean, just to say, everyone should be like listening to this and who are not. I mean, just say there's also other stuff than Marvel and DC out there. There's really, really good, interesting stuff coming out these years. And for instance, I mean, there's the Danish. I mean, there are quite a few Danish comic books coming out as well, and quite a few Danes who are like illustrating for and writing comics abroad as well. So that's just, and I don't actually know that much about it anymore. I'm just sort of registering that it's there. But also just going like to comic book sort of events in Denmark, so it's become huge. Which is heartening for a nerd like me to see.
I mean, a lot of the comics I have at home are from the distributor Image Comics, which was created in the 90s by a lot of superhero writers and artists who were tired of Marvel and DC and how they did their business. So they made these, which is all creator owned. So all the creators own the rights to their own characters rather than the company. and it was started by, amongst others, Robert Kirkman, who was from Walking Dead, and he's still the main editor there, and they do so many comics right now, and a lot of it like award-winning stuff. I mean, the Saga comic books they've done, which is by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples, has won, I think, 3 Eisner Awards, which is the Oscars for comics. So I mean, they put out a lot of really, really good, interesting stuff that's easy to get into because there's no barrier of entry. You just buy the first one in the series and you can get off. And a lot of them, they have a specific. They actually do this thing where the first book in the series is always the cheapest one.
Yeah.
So I think it's 80 kroner for
like when you buy drugs. Like,
exactly. It's like drugs. So 80 kroner you can get like the first trade paperback of any of their series. So it's a really great way to get into comics. If you want to explore it, they have so many great series that you can get into pretty cheaply.
And I think also, I mean, this and another thing about so there would be like the overall sort of superficialness. I don't know, Superman going to be whoever. But again, going back to this idea of what the X-Men talking about difference and otherness and so on. And various sorts of minorities, but I think it's also hilarious sometimes you go back to look at some of the older comics, like for instance, like Wonder Woman, how that was originally created. The story of I mean the fact that it was Marston. Yeah. The fact is basically a psychologist. And his wife and mistress. And
who all lived together in the same house. And
no, also the fact that at one point they picked up on from the company distributing this, like, wait a minute, every third image is basically bondage because that's what he was into. Like, so he's a sort of strong feminist character, but also they were constantly sort of tying each other up. That's sort of why she's got the lasso and so on, right? It's just like that's hilarious. It's been there for a long time. No one really picked up on it, and then all of a sudden it's. Yeah.
There's some weird stories behind the creators of some of the comic books. I mean, you have told me that story about Wonder Woman before, and also told me some other story where I'm just sort of shaking my head.
Yeah.
I think there's a new series or film out actually on Wonder Woman.
Yeah, there was one a couple years ago, a movie. I think it was called Professor Marston and the Wonder Woman or something like that, which was a.
But I think there's a new one coming out as well.
Yeah,
Just the creation process behind it is also something that people pick up on.
I believe there's a Netflix documentary series about the creation of several of the most famous characters, and there's one on Wonder Woman, and it's
really watchable.
It's worth getting into.
I mean. That's basically a whole other topic about how these creative forces combine to make some of these obscure characters. But in a way, some of the people, like you're talking about, is sort of the most obscure characters in themselves, who was creating these. Alan Moore is also an extremely interesting man, even though he has made some of the great. I mean, he was also the one who made V for Vendetta.
Yeah.
Actually, Grant Morrison, the guy I mentioned earlier, he's famous for claiming that he once communed with the spirit of John Lennon on a roof in Kathmandu after he dropped a bunch of acid. So he's also done lots of wonderful stuff.
Well, I think there's been a lot of drugs involved when they're sort of coming up with these characters.
Yeah, but there's also, Alan Moore's definitely done it all.
Yeah.
But, and you can see that also in some of the comic books. It's basically like these acid trips. A League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which is also a series he's done. There's one of them where they basically go to the swing 60s in London, and it's just like all this huge psychedelia. It's a really bad book, but that's kind of fun.
Also, he also did a book which was about 3 fairy tale heroes, like these princesses from fairy tales, who met up and discussed their sex lives.
Lost Girls, but it was banned for many years. He did it with his wife. I think she's a sex therapist or something. I don't know, but they done this book years and years ago. But because I think one of them was using Alice in Wonderland, I think, so the estate that had the rights for that, they just blocked it for like 10, 15, 20 years. It's Peter Pan, actually. I can't remember, but it's one of it's Wendy, I think, actually. Yeah. And they were like, we don't want Wendy, erotic adventure kind of thing. But it's not a particularly good comic book, but it's kind of, they've done that, they experimented with lots of different things.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, sort of censorship has changed a lot of through time also in comic books and sort of in general in media.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, Game of Thrones is a perfect example. I mean, just the fact that there's a lot of sex scenes on, it would have been unheard of like 30, 40
What
years
they
ago.
used to be.
I mean, for Game of Thrones, they coined a term called
Sexposition.
Yeah, sexposition.
Yeah.
Where it's when they want to get some exposition out of the way, they want to explain something to the audience. They do it while there's some kind of sex on screen to keep people interested, which is an interesting way of going about it.
Yeah, probably not something we should take up at university.
Well, to end it off, where do you guys think or hope sort of this pop culture, nerd culture is going to evolve? Are you sort of tired of it, Rune, and just want it sort of to delve down, or what do you think it's going to, which way it's going to head?
Nerd culture and pop culture, no, I don't think it's going to die, and I don't want it to, and I don't think, it's here to stay.
Yeah.
It's been here always, but and again, I love the fact that it's been more mainstream and acceptable, and people have so many diverse interests rather than just like doing one thing. But that would be another thing that I think the Marvel universe that has dominated too much for me. Again, because it's not that diverse, and I mean, it's in that particular, you've got 22 films you can discuss and so on, but there's lots of other stuff that sort of gets drowned out in this sort of white noise. So I'd actually love to see it just expand a bit. But I don't think, that'll happen on its own. Same thing with the zombies. And before that, vampires. I mean, there'll be new things. I mean, give another 5-10 years, we'll see whatever it is. That'll be the main thing. What will come after Game of Thrones? What will come after the Avengers? And I still think superhero movies are here for a long time because it's just, because it was such a huge box office, obviously people like it and want to have more of it, I think.
I think in terms of nerd culture and pop culture, I think right now a big struggle internally in there is fan produced content, fan fiction and fan art and stuff, because there's been a lot of conflict between the fans and the authors, and I also think that one of the things that's really a big conflict right now is authors and creators going back and sort of editing their own content. We've seen a lot of critics of J.K. Rowling who's been spewing out weird facts like the fact that wizards would just shit wherever and then vanish it afterwards, or that Gandalf was gay and also he had a very torrid romance with Grindelwald, like stuff like that, where they go back and insert new stuff or change it to fit the current times better. I mean, we've seen a lot. There's a lot right now of the Russo brothers from Endgame being accused of pulling a J.K. Rowling, where they over-explain parts of their own movie after it's come out. So I think that's an interesting conflict right now. And
that goes back to what you said earlier about the internet as a factor, because this means that rather than having someone in Hollywood or an author writing something, and there's an ownership there of the author doing that, or the direction and so on. Now it's much more of an idea of communal ownership. That's what the internet has done. That's also why people now petition to remake season 8 of Game of Thrones, because they thought they wouldn't live up to what they wanted, right? And the original sort of sinner and bad guy in this was, of course, George Lucas, when he came out with the old films and sort of inserted stuff in them that people didn't want, right? And the same thing, we see the Game of Thrones, you see with Endgame and so on. And I think that's, and again, that it doesn't all of it go back to the internet, but it certainly it's a huge impact in how we think about these things and how we consume it, but also how we produce it. Because again, there's been so much fan fiction, and when they do these things, often they screen it to see what is it the fans want, and then that goes into it, which is different from how it was. You have things like this sort of before, but not to the same extent that we have it now. So, sort of participatory aspect of being instead of just be a passive consumer, we're now also sort of influencing them a lot the other way around.
Yeah, personally, I sort of hope that the Marvel Universe stop trying to tie all the movies together, because I can't keep up anymore. There's so many movies. But I think it's going to be interesting to see where they're going. Maybe some of these fan fiction, as you're talking about on the internet, actually is going to be something legit, and we're going to get a 50 Shades of Peter Parker or something in the future, like with the Twilight movies.
But 50 Shades is the perfect example because
Yeah.
I mean, it was done after she was copying Twilight, right? And
Yeah.
like making a section, but then she made it into her own, which was fan-based fiction.
It was
taken
straight
up
up fan fiction of Twilight.
Twilight, yeah, but then she moved. It's because of like problems with rights and so on.
Yeah.
She changed, but then that's now an original, right? But,
Yeah.
but then someone could be doing something similar with her work and at infinitum, sort of just keep on doing that. But
Yeah.
Well, on that note, I think we're going to end this episode. I would like to say thank you to Rune, and thank you for Mikkel to fill in for Denne this week. And next time we are going to have Kasper back when he's coming back from America and talking about his adventures in America. And that's going to be the last episode of this semester.